question. The concern is that, you know, we sit in a room, we sit in these hearings, and we can talk about, I guess, the impacts, but when the contractor gets out in the field, they're not aware of necessarily, oftentimes they're not aware of the sensitivity of the limit of work. And so, in their haste to construct the site and do it as, you know, as efficiently as they believe, sometimes they wander outside the area of disturbance.
Mm-hmm.
And so, given that this area is so constrained, I thought it was worthwhile noting that. The other thing that is, you know, you'll never know until you get in there is just what the nature of the material is in the wetlands. You know, for instance, I had a project once where there was, you know, 40 feet of peat. We don't have any information about that, and you're not gonna have information about that until you construct until you get in there to dig it out to construct it. So, you know, those things can really affect the construction of the crossing. And so those are, you know, I just want to alert the board that and I'm not saying there's 40 feet of peat, probably isn't, but it was just a surprise, and so that's one thing that can affect how much land you disturb when you're in there. And given it's so close to the threshold, it's so close to that 5,000 square foot threshold, it's, in my opinion, it's a valid concern.
Okay, thank you. Good. And the second question, I just wanted to revisit, I'm a little confused about where we are about our consultants talking to the peer reviewers outside the public meetings. It sounded like, from what Mr. Turner was saying, he could benefit for some more information, like the soil samples, for example, when we get those, and he mentioned the time of concentration assumptions and various other aspects that would better inform his review of the project. So, what is the board's preference? May our consultants speak with the peer reviewers outside of these hearings?
Well, that's a good question, Mr. Casciano. I'm happy you brought it up, because it's something that the board has not discussed in public session and really hasn't discussed in private session. So let me just outline the issue for the members of the public out there.
Sure.
And I can talk to my colleagues and see what's the best way to approach the issue. The issue is this. We are presently acting under the open meeting law, and that's why we're here, so that everyone can hear exactly what the evidence is, see the witnesses, and make any determinations that they think is proper, ask questions, send us letters, make public comment at the appropriate time in these proceedings. And the Board of Appeals has always been particularly vigilant in conducting meetings in public. It's a rare day when we go into executive session, and it's usually to discuss ongoing litigation, which is obviously one of the exceptions to the open meeting law. I don't know that there's any definitive decisions on the issue of experts for both sides consulting with each other out of the public hearing process. I have done some research on it, and it appears that commentators who have addressed the issue look at it either somewhat conservatively or liberally. The conservatives seem to think that it is inappropriate for, that the proper way to do it is to have the town appoint a representative to represent the town, that at the town clerk's office a notice would be published that the representative of the town and the experts are going to be meeting for the purposes of trying to resolve these issues and discuss the issues. For example, at this particular facility or at Milton Town Hall at 7 o'clock on such and such a date, so that the public is aware of it and the public can attend the meeting and be aware of what's being said, and other interested people. For example, Attorney John Whitten is back there. Attorney Whitten could attend that meeting and listen to what's being said, and suggest comments, object, do whatever anyone wanted to do. And then after that meeting of the experts, any agreements that they've been able to reach would be reported to the Board of Appeals by the representative of the town, so that at the public meeting, the public would be then aware of what has been agreed to, and perhaps where the differences are and what has to be decided. Sometimes Board of Appeals members, up to one member, could attend those sessions. I'm not sure. I think that's appropriate, to be frank. And I think the articles that I read indicated that if 2 members of the Board of Appeals attended those meetings, that would be a meeting of the Board of Appeals that had to be published and had to be subject to the open meeting law. My view of it, and the lesser view is that they can meet, it doesn't have to be published, but that any agreements that have been reached should be discussed at an open public hearing, the next public hearing of the board, and everyone would become aware of them at that time. So I don't know what my colleague's preference is. I did have conversations with Mr. Casciano at an earlier date, and I guess I'm leaning towards the stricter side of things, principally because in any controversial project, and I'm not suggesting this one is, whenever decisions are made or agreements are made by the parties and their experts, even in good faith, as I know everyone here is acting in good faith, if those decisions are just told to the public without the public being aware of the meeting, who's there, what's being said, it's behind closed doors, so to speak, though I don't mean any invidious inference there. I'm not sure that preserves public confidence in the process that we're going through here. We have these meetings in public. I think my preference is they don't have to be advertised, but just publish with the town clerk and presumably put on the town website. My preference is to open up the doors, let everyone understand what people are saying, and if they reach agreements, that's fine. Anyone can object to the agreement, and we can all deal with that in the public session. It's very difficult to attend a public session and have the representative say, well, we've agreed on this, and we've agreed on that, and go through a checklist. It's somewhat, it's like the difficulty that Mr. Turner just faced. He has a report, he did a comprehensive study. He noted 50 items that would have put everyone to sleep if he had gone through them. So he did them in a very nice way. But he's here. If anyone has questions to ask, they can do it. It's not sending us a letter that we're bound by. And I'm just concerned that I don't want anyone to think that this project is being compromised in any way by agreements of experts, whether for cost or money or time or for whatever reason. I just think all of that issue, any adverse inferences that could be drawn by meetings of experts at their offices, at the engineering firm or anywhere else, I think it could, it's not illegal, I just think it could taint the process, and I'd rather have the process entirely public, and if people want to blame the board, then so be it, but I don't want any inferences whatsoever that the public didn't have the right to know if they want to know. So with that having been said, let me ask Mr. Jeffrey Mullen, how do you prefer to proceed in these circumstances, knowing we want to try to reduce the formalities of things, but we want to keep the public perception and knowledge of these things available?
So I looked at this guidance that came from, I don't know where it came from. MHA maybe?
Yeah, some of those things are in
MHP,
Yeah.
Mass Housing.
Match housing articles.
You know, I mean, this kind of thing happens all the time, right? This kind of thing happens all the time, right?
I do.
I like your idea, John, of having an open meeting and open the doors and not having to publish it, because it's not a meeting of the governmental body and therefore wouldn't be an open meeting under the open meeting law. I don't think a member of the ZBA should attend it. That doesn't strike me as appropriate at all, because we're the decision-making board. Nor do I think the consultants can make any decisions in meetings like that. They're really making recommendations, good recommendations. I think you did a great job, Scott. I see these meetings as technical review meetings to save time and to consider technical issues that come up and that are inevitable in the areas of engineering and traffic and wastewater and stormwater and all of the things that go into projects. But I think they're really in the nature of modifying the recommendations that have been made to the board for the purpose of the board making a decision. And I wouldn't want any, I'm focused on that word agreement, because I really think this is a presentation of facts and an opportunity for the board to make an ultimate decision on the application. And I think that's just my experience with working with consultants like that. That's generally how they work anyway, and they're very familiar with making recommendations to their respective clients. So I don't think anybody would have an issue with that. And then lastly, I think meetings like that need to have minutes. And there needs to be minutes of the meeting, and then we can make those minutes part of the formal record, so that we can have an official note that this meeting did take place, and that this was the purpose of the meeting. And I think meetings like that can be really helpful to the process and can move us along, and I would encourage it.
Mrs. King?
I'm in agreement. Keep it short and sweet.
Thank you. I appreciate your brevity. Let me just ask Jeffrey one issue. Who would take the minutes of the meeting? Because, obviously, Mrs. Fitzgerald is here, but that's certainly far beyond her job.
I lay it on one of the engineers, because they're really good at that, and then they can, usually what happens, and this has been my experience, you have minutes, and then the draft minutes get sent to all the parties and say, give me corrections by Friday. If you don't give me corrections, I'll consider it final, or something like that. You can agree with that, and I don't see anybody shaking their head, but I'm sure that most of the people in this room have been through this process before, so something like that, because I do think that the minutes are really a mechanism for capturing the essence of the meeting, purpose of the meeting, and the recommendation. So I can see, for example, that if Jim had made a suggestion, Scott may say, I like that response to item number 14 in my letter. And that's not a decision, that's a recommendation, that kind of thing. And that could get memorialized in the meeting minutes, and action items can follow, and then a report can be made to the board. So I would leave it to the parties attending the meeting.
Okay, and those minutes are filed with the board at the next board meeting after the expert consultation has taken place. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
something like that. Yeah.
Is that, you concur with that? Mr. Casciano, do you want to be heard on this?
I just have one follow-up question.
Sure.
How about information sharing? For example, when we get the soil reports back, we don't want to schedule a meeting to convey information.
I agree with that, and I think that's the sharing of technical reports and information is fair game, I think. It's silly to be noticing that with the town clerk, and just like you're providing us with information, we just report to the public at the next meeting what you've supplied us, and it's all a matter of the public record, and if the public wants to go to the Board of Appeals clerk's office and read it and get copies, they certainly can do so. So I think it's the actual meeting and/or participation in a meeting with the attempt to reach some type of recommendation or agreement that's noticed. And I think we just have to give 48 hours of notice with the clerk, though Mrs. Fitzgerald could correct me on that, and that's easily done. And I think all you do is just call up Mary Fitzgerald, and I think you'd be happy to file that with the town clerk. And I certainly will speak with any appropriate town official to make sure that, the place of the meeting would have to be cited in the notice to the clerk, and we'd to go out of our way to make accommodations at some public space that's convenient to everybody. That makes sense?
It does, thank you.
Good. And so with that, Mr. Turner,
Just
Mr.
make
Mullen, please.
Just on the information sharing, I just think it's important that anything that goes to the consultant goes to the town. So that it's in Mary's file. So I think there are gonna be people who are watching tonight who are gonna wanna go up to town hall and see what's going on.
Sure.
Thanks, Al.
Okay, that's great. So that's the way we'll proceed. I think it may be a little more fussy and time-consuming than under normal circumstance, but I think it's, if the process is looked upon as open and available to the public, I think we all gain a lot in our credibility and in our decision-making. And then if people want to criticize the board or anyone else, they can do it.
Call you at home.
That's fair game, and fortunately, that hasn't happened, but
Yeah.
who knows, not yet. Mr. Turner, thank you very much. We appreciate the report, and I assume, Mr. Casciano, at some point, perhaps after the 31st, when the town has made its presentation, that if you have any comments on Mr. Turner's report and/or revisions in your application or drawings or whatever, that you'll share those with Mr. Turner, because he'll be getting back to us
Sure.
on final comments to you.
And just so I'm clear on that, on the 31st, there'll be a town presentation, essentially, the fire department, police department, et cetera, here. But the applicant will not be presenting at that. There'll be a subsequent hearing.
Well,
after.
that's right, because I think it's unfair to have the applicant respond to something that the fire chief says that, let's assume he is going to testify on the 31st, there's no obligation. I have not met the fire chief, so I'm not ordering his presence. I couldn't do it if I wanted to. But I assume the fire chief is going to be here. I don't know what the fire chief is going to say. He is probably not going to, he's a town employee, so he's not an independent consultant. So I doubt whether he's going to file 4 or 5 days before the board meeting a report. And I assume that he may have a report at the meeting, he may not, he doesn't have to, and his comments may be oral. And I think that would be very unfair to put you in the position of having to respond to something that the fire chief has to say, that you've heard 5 minutes later. And you
Sure.
may hear 8 witnesses. I don't know how many witnesses are going to testify on the 31st. So on the 31st, we'll schedule another meeting, and presumably we'll have finished with the town, but maybe the town needs more time. I don't have the slightest idea. But if it does not, then we'll pick a time and when it would be convenient for you to give any revisions to your plans. Here are some of them here, but any comments to the experts that have testified tonight and the town officials who will express their opinions. If you need more than one session, you're certainly free to do that. We'll give you as much time as you need. We want to expedite this process, maybe more than you do at the present time. And at some point, after you've made your comments, we're going to open this up to public comment. As we've discussed before, we want to hear from the public. The public can submit letters. We guarantee you we'll read every letter. If there are general oppositions to the project, you can sign a petition. That's the way it's usually done. It's a nice way to do it, and you avoid 50 people or 10 people or 500 people trying to be heard at the Board of Appeals. And likewise, if there are petitions in support of this project, in support of the 40B project and its effect on the town, we're delighted to hear from them. We'll have some guidelines to try to limit comments to relevant issues and so that we'll have time for everyone to speak. And we won't have one person speaking for an hour, as sometimes happens in the great Republic of Cambridge that I have some familiarity with. But we certainly want the public to have the full opportunity to be heard on this application. And I think at that point, we'll be in a position to see whether we need any more hearings or whether it's time to discuss it and vote on it. Is that satisfactory to you, Mr. Casciano? Okay, great. Mr. Turner, thank you very, very much. We're delighted to have you stick around if if you want to hear Mr. Dirk's presentation, but, yeah, Mr. Whitten, please.
Mr. Turner's excuse, might I ask him three very quick questions on behalf of the student body?
Of course you can.
Mr. Turner, was tonight the first time you heard?
He's gotta get mic'd.
Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, thank you very much. Mr. Whitten, would you come up here and take this microphone? You can put it, you don't have to sit there, you can just grab it and,
So, I'm next to you, Mr. Turner, but I'm gonna speak into the mic.
Okay.
Was tonight the first time you heard that the Conservation Commission had denied under the local wetlands bylaw?
Yes,
The development team didn't share that information with you?
no,
The second question, Mr. Chairman, is, are you aware, Mr. Turner, that there's a deed restriction on the property limiting the use of a portion of the property regarding structures and parking?
no,
If you were aware of the deed restriction and you were to conclude that the deed restriction didn't allow 20 parking spaces out of the total being shown, would that affect your opinion to the Board of Appeals in terms of the sufficiency of parking?
I guess I'd have to look at the deed restriction, it could affect it.
Would the reduction of 20 parking spaces affect the efficiency of the parking design?
Yes,
And then my third question, Mr. Turner, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, is your recommendation of a 5-foot sidewalk. Have you done the calculation as to what impact that has on the BVW, bordering vegetated wetland fill?
no,
Are you aware, or have you been told that that might raise the threshold of fill above 5,000 square feet of bordering vegetated wetland?
I know it's gonna impact it, but I don't know if it would impact it, if it would bring it over the 5,000 square feet, I didn't do that math.
And in your recommendation to the Board of Appeals regarding the 5-foot sidewalk, you're not thinking about the impact on the BVW, you're thinking about public safety?
I'm thinking about both, I guess.
But you haven't analyzed the BVW
No.
impact?
Nope.
Would it matter to you whether there was a threshold being exceeded of 5,000 square feet?
No,
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Turner.
thank you, Mr. Whitten. Mr. Turner, thanks a lot. Yeah,
Sure.
as I was saying before we gave the floor to Mr. Whitten, we're delighted to have you stick around and continue if you want to hear Mr. Dirk's presentation, but you're certainly excused for the evening if you'd like to get home to your family.
okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want Mr. Turner to think that there's actually a Conservation Commission denial of the local bylaw permit. That permit application is pending here as part of the comprehensive permit application
Yes,
before the Board of Appeals. And Mr. Whitten just characterized it a little bit differently, but we've attempted to be very clear both in writing and verbally about the status of that.
Right, we understand, I think Mr. Turner does,
There
I
hasn't
think
been
we
a denial.
actually gave you a copy of the Conservation Commission order, which we just received as well, so.
Okay, I mean, to be honest with you, that doesn't really affect my comments at all. So it's, whether it's denied or not, I mean, I'm working for you and this board and not the Conservation
I
Commission.
think Ms. Newman was just trying to make a correction, a modification of Mr. Whitten's comments. But
If I could, Mr. Chairman, I don't think Mr. Whitten misspoke. What Mr. Whitten said was the facts, which is the Conservation Commission, and the development team was right there in the room with me. The Conservation Commission denied pursuant to the local bylaw. That is a fact, and that is the order of conditions that the board has before it.
they left open the state
That is correct.
wetlands regulations.
That is correct, but because Milton has a local wetlands bylaw, and because the Board of Appeals has not made a decision on a waiver of the local bylaw, and most notably, because the applicant chose to file with the Concom first, what the Conservation Commission did was perfectly appropriate. There is now a denial. The applicant can choose to file an appeal in Superior Court or not.
No, I think Ms. Newman understands that better than the board, and whether we get, the board has the opportunity of addressing the local bylaw and deciding which waivers, if any, are appropriate under the circumstance. And I think that, from what I read, the Conservation Commission is going to be dealing with the state issue, but it's up to this board whether we're going to waive portions of the local bylaw. I think, in essence, without getting involved in semantics, that's where we are. That issue, as Ms. Newman said when she introduced herself to the board, that issue is before the board. That's that's here. And that's what we're going to be dealing with. Okay?
I just want to make clear, though, there is a denial from the Concom. The jurisdictional issue is a separate question. The applicant.
We understand that.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Whitten. We appreciate your presence. Thank you, Mr. Turner. Let me get my materials. Mr. Dirk. Welcome to the Board of Appeals.
Oh, good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. For the record, my name is Jeffrey Dirk. I'm principal with Vanessa and Associates, and I think as you had mentioned at the outset of the hearing, we were retained through the Board of Selectmen on your behalf to conduct a review of the application, and specifically, my role is as the traffic engineer is to review the traffic study that was submitted for the project, which you have in your packet. As well as a site plan. And there's some overlap, as Mr. Turner had mentioned, in terms of his review and my review, although my review relative to the site plan is not so much looking at the grading and drainage aspects, it's to look at circulation within the site. And circulation is with respect to not only motor vehicles, but it's also pedestrians and bicycles as well, and looking at how those elements interact with the site plan. And so there is going to be some overlap with respect to some of the comments relative to the access, but what you'll see in terms of my comments on the site plan does deal with those things. It deals with vehicle circulation, it deals with parking, and it deals with pedestrian and bicycle accommodations as well, as those all relate to the transportation system. Similar to, I think, the line of questions you had from Mr. Turner at the beginning, the materials that we had reviewed as a part of the project consisted of everything that's in the public record. So there's nothing outside of the public record that we've reviewed. So it consists of the site plan application, the comprehensive permit application, the traffic study, and the site plans as revised through, I believe, November 26, 2014 was the last revision to the site plan. In addition to those materials, as a kind of standard course in conducting the review, we do rely on other publicly available information. So that information would consist of materials that are available online through the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, specifically relating to elements of the transportation system dealing with motor vehicle crashes at intersections, functional classifications of roadways. And when I speak of classification of roadways, the state classifies roadways based on the type of access that they provide to adjacent properties. So we're all familiar with interstate highways, limited access highways, as well as local roadways that are primarily what you see in your residential street system. So looking at those classifications, and the importance of that deals with how the project relates to the transportation system. Certain roadways have we'll say a higher level of classification in that their primary purpose is through movement of vehicles at higher rates of speeds. And so you want to look at the classifications of roadways as they relate to the environment in which the project is located. So information through the Department of Transportation is reviewed. There's also standards that, as traffic engineers and transportation planners, that we apply to projects, and we review those standards to ensure that as the project is developed and as documents are presented to you, that they're in fact applying those industry standards. And those standards, as I'll refer to some of them, are published by the Institute of Transportation Engineers, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, and there's also the Massachusetts Department of Transportation has design guidelines, and those design guidelines apply to not only means and methods of designing roadways and driveways and how projects such as this that do interact with the state highway system, they have to comply with certain standards. But it also deals with the way that traffic studies and such are conducted. Those, again, are all publicly available documents, and we rely on those as we review the project itself. Now, our role as a peer review consultant is it's not really to reproduce the documents that are before you. It's not to conduct independent studies. It's to review the materials that you have before you and comment on those with respect to how they meet the standards of the profession. And specifically, what we're looking at from the standpoint of a 40B project is we look at kind of the off-site infrastructure, and this would apply to some of the things that Mr. Turner reviews relative to wastewater and such. As you get outside of the property boundary, there's a presumption that there's adequate capacity on the infrastructure to support the development itself. So really what we're looking at, and kind of the key things, are public health, safety, and welfare. The applicant needs to demonstrate that all of those kind of criteria are met with respect to the transportation system as well. So primarily, we're looking at adequacy of access and how that adequacy of access is demonstrated with respect to safety as well. So as I go through my comments, you'll see that really the focus is on those elements, and those are some of the things that we've raised some questions on and provided some guidance to the applicant. It's not, I think, similar to, again, the line of questioning you had from Mr. Turner, it's not our role to develop solutions for the applicant, but it is our role to provide some guidance so that as they look at responding to our comments, that they have some guidance on how we might approach addressing those. But it's not up to us to solve the problem for the applicant, but to offer some guidance to them on how they might approach developing some solutions. So similar to what Mr. Turner had done, we have a 12-page letter, but I would suggest to you that a lot of it is presenting some of the facts that the applicant had presented relative to the application and summarizing those. And then beyond that are some questions and comments we have on those. So I'll go through each of those, but it's not really reading 12 pages, but I'll hit the highlights of our review, similar to the approach that Mr. Turner had done.
Sure, that'd be great, and just let me reiterate that if anyone, member of the public, somebody on TV or whatever, wants a copy of Mr. Dirk's report, it certainly is on file with the Board of Appeals Clerk's Office and is publicly available.
Certainly.
Please.
So as you follow on with the letter itself, we've structured the letter so that it basically follows the format of the traffic study. So as you look at the traffic study and you look at our letter, you can kind of go page by page through that and look at the topic areas, and they'll relate to the topic areas of the traffic study as go through that. So the first element that we look at, we'll call it more or less general housekeeping items. Now, these housekeeping items relate to those standards that I had mentioned. So the traffic study that you have that was submitted as a part of the application before you was prepared in a professional manner. There's certain things that we've asked to be done to the traffic study to indicate compliance with standards, and I'll go through those with you. The first thing is relative to the traffic study itself. Randolph Avenue is a state highway. It's Route 28. That roadway is under the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. So because of that, there's a couple of things that we've asked the applicant to look at. The first is the project will require what's known as a state highway access permit from the Department of Transportation. That access permit, it's independent of the 40B process that you have. It's a state application that's required for any development. Because of that, there are certain things that go along with the development as well. And the first thing is that we've suggested that the applicant should review the project in relation to what's known as the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. What that act does is it has a certain set of standards and thresholds that apply to projects that require a state action. And a state action is essentially a permit or some type of action that a state agency must undertake relative to a project. Now, if a project has a state action required for it, in this instance, the state action is the need to obtain a state highway access permit from the Department of Transportation. So because of that, the project needs to be reviewed by the team, the applicant's team, to see if there's any thresholds of the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act that may be exceeded. We've reviewed it from the standpoint of transportation and reviewed the transportation thresholds of the Mass Environmental Protection Act. And we don't see that it's going to exceed one of those thresholds. We've asked for them to verify that. But beyond that, there are other thresholds that are non-transportation related. However, because there's a need to obtain the state highway access permit, those other thresholds need to be reviewed as well, because again, the state highway access permit is a state threshold. So even though the transportation thresholds may not be exceeded, some other thresholds may be. And so we're just suggesting that review needs to take place. One of those thresholds, and the applicants, I think, legal team can respond to this as well. It could have to do with the fact of the Conservation Commission approvals that are being gone through, and specifically, it wouldn't relate to the local bylaw that we had mentioned, but certainly if, for one reason or another, the Conservation Commission makes a finding that the state bylaw, for one reason they deny, let's say, the permit for that, then the superseding order of conditions would be a DEP permit, and that would be another state action. Because that hasn't happened, I wouldn't suggest that thresholds relating to that permit be reviewed at this point, because it would be speculative since it hasn't happened. But again, they should go through, and we're asking for them to just verify that none of the thresholds are exceeded. If a threshold's exceeded, there would be another filing that would need to take place. So they just need to review that. The other item relative to the traffic study in particular is that it is required by Mass General Law that if a traffic study is similar to a site plan, it's an engineering document that's prepared by a professional. That document needs to be stamped by a professional engineer, similar to the site plans. The copy of the document, at least that we had, was not stamped and signed by a professional engineer. So what we've suggested is that the applicant's engineer needs to provide a letter just attesting to the fact that it was prepared under the direction of a professional engineer and indicating the license number of that engineer and that they have the requisite qualifications for preparing that document. So you really need that for your records in order to demonstrate compliance with the Mass General Law. The other thing relating to the state highway access permit is because of the fact that a state access permit is required, the Massachusetts Department of Transportation has standards that apply to the preparation of traffic studies. Those standards were actually recently updated. The update and the updated guidance that came out was published it became effective actually at the end of March of last year. So those standards came into in force prior to the preparation of this traffic study. So what you'll see throughout our comments is we're saying that the traffic study is submitted. It complied basically with those old guidelines. It doesn't apply with the new guidelines. So the study does need to be updated to comply with those guidelines. And specific areas I'll go through in my comments that require some adjustment by the applicant's engineer. And we've gone through each of those to let the applicant know which areas they need to focus on as they go through and doing their update. So now getting to the traffic study itself. The traffic study has a specific study area that they evaluated in the study. It's our understanding that that study area was developed in consultation with the Department of Public Works for the town of Milton, and it consisted of the two major intersections, basically the signalized intersections on either side of the project. So the Randolph Avenue at Reedsdale Road intersection to the north of the project site, and then to the south of the project site, the Randolph Avenue Reed Street intersection, both signalized intersections to either side of the project. It's typical when you're conducting a traffic study that you do, at a minimum, want to look at the major intersections on either side, and they've done that. So we are in agreement with that, but one of the things that we did note was that the Pleasant Street intersection, which is just to the immediate north of the project site, it's a one-way roadway heading away from Randolph Avenue. That was not included in the study. We noted, and basically on the next comment I'll get into more detail on it, between the applicant's driveway and the Reedsdale Road intersection, there's a significant drop in traffic based on the traffic counts that they had done. So in essence, that the vehicles had to go someplace. And so the presumption is that they're using the Pleasant Street intersection, or using Pleasant Street to depart from Randolph Avenue, and so they're not showing up at the next intersection. And because of that, there may be a need to study that intersection, because clearly if there's a significant volume of traffic using that roadway, We would presume that the project's traffic would also use that roadway, given that that's the kind of the way that commuters are using the road. And so we're suggesting that may be an intersection that may need to be added to the study area, just so that you can get a complete picture of how the project's traffic will relate to the transportation infrastructure. The applicant has done traffic counts at the intersections we had mentioned, as well as on Randolph Avenue. There's two ways that they do their traffic counts. The first thing is what's known as an automatic traffic recorder count, and you're probably familiar with the rubber road tubes that you see out on the roadways. Those type of traffic counts are used to measure volume of traffic over an extended time period. So in this case, over 24 hours or 48 hours. And they've done that on Randolph Avenue. It's appropriate. It's something that you use in order to see if there's variations in traffic patterns, as well as to look at just total volume of traffic on the roadway itself over an extended time period. The other type of data collection is manual turning movement counts, and that's when you physically have people out standing or sitting in cars at intersections, and they're counting the vehicles that are going through the intersection itself and looking at how many are making left turns, right turns, also looking at the type of traffic that's on the roadway, cars, trucks, buses, looking at pedestrian activity, looking at bicycle activity at those specific intersections. The time periods that were analyzed for the project, for residential projects, the peak traffic volume periods are going to happen when people are generally going to work in the morning, coming back in the afternoon. So the time periods you're looking at are basically in the morning between 7 and 9, and in the evening between 4 and 6. And that's when your commuter traffic is going to happen on the roadways. So they've conducted their traffic counts during those time periods. The automatic traffic recorder count was done on a weekday over 48 hours. Again, that's when the peak traffic on the roadway as well as the project is going to happen. So those time periods are acceptable. The data collection, the way that they went about conducting the studies are acceptable. They comply with industry standards. As I mentioned, we don't do our own traffic counts, but the way that we look at the data that they had collected is we look at the way the counts were conducted, and then we look at the data itself to see if there's any anomalies in the data. If we see that for some reason the traffic counts all of a sudden dropped off, or if there's something that doesn't look standard in terms of comparing, one of the things that we can do is look at that rubber road tubes, which are not subject really to human error. They just count the cars that go over them. We can compare those road tube counts to the manual turning movement counts at the intersections and see if there's anything that doesn't look copacetic between those, if there's any anomalies again. So we've done that and confirmed that the data collection was done in accordance with standards. There was no anomalies to that. So we've kind of verified that there's nothing that says to us that there was any anomalies in the way the data was collected. Now, the traffic counts themselves, they were conducted in February of 2014. What I would mention relative to the time period, month of the year that the data collection was done, the state requires that we look at what's known as an average month condition. And so traffic counts are conducted throughout the year for various projects. We often can't control when we're conducting the traffic study. So what we rely on is what's known as some seasonal adjustments to this data. And the Massachusetts Department of Transportation maintains permanent count stations throughout the state. Those count stations that they have, they collect data 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And so what you're able to do is look at that traffic count data from those permanent count stations, and you compare that count data to the monthly data. You compare that to the month that you did have perform your traffic counts, and then you can make a seasonal adjustment so that you can take February traffic counts and adjust those to what's known as an average month condition. And average months tend to be about April, May-ish would be an average month, and then around October is also an average month. So that's generally during those months is when you experience average traffic flow. And so they've taken the February traffic volumes, adjusted them to an average month condition. We verified that that adjustment was done correctly. The February counts actually have to be adjusted upwards. February is below average, so they've adjusted them upwards. And that was done in accordance with industry standards, where we agree with the methodology and the adjustment that was made. The other thing that they've done as a part of their data collection effort is measure travel speeds. The travel speeds are measured at the same time that the automatic traffic recorder counts are done. So those rubber road tubes are not only measuring volume of traffic, they're also measuring speed of traffic, and they do that In this case, they measured the speed of every single vehicle traveling along Randolph Avenue for 48 hours. That speed measurement, and just to give it some context, Randolph Avenue, on the days they had done their traffic counts, accommodated just shy of 25,000 vehicles per day, and that's two-way traffic over 24 hours. So as they measure speed of traffic over 48 hours, they're basically taking a snapshot of 50,000 vehicles. So it's 25,000 vehicles per day for 2 days. So they measure the speed of 50,000 vehicles on the roadway. So it's very statistically valid in terms of what the results of that would be, and that's important to us as we look at their measurements themselves. So the speed of traffic along Randolph Avenue, those, as they measured it for 50,000 vehicles, they measured both an average speed of the 50,000 vehicles and also what's known as an 85th percentile travel speed. So that speed is the speed at which 85% of the vehicles either traveled at or below during their observation periods. That's a critical speed measurement that we use in assessing sight distances, and they use as well. It's often used in setting posted speed limits. If the state is going to set, or the town would like to set a posted speed limit, and they apply to the Department of Transportation, it's that 85th percentile speed that is the critical measurement that's used for both design as well as setting posted speed limits. Randolph Avenue in this area, it's a little uncharacteristic in terms of posted speed. Generally, you have the same speed limit in both directions. This section of Randolph Avenue has a speed limit of, I believe, 40 miles an hour, I think, southbound, and 45 miles an hour northbound. Again, as I mentioned, it's not characteristic that you do that. It's typically the same in both directions. But the 85th percentile speed that they measured on the roadway was 46 miles an hour. So as they looked at 50,000 vehicles, 85% of the 50,000 vehicles traveled at 46 miles an hour or below. It's generally in line with the posted speed limit in one direction, 5 miles an hour over the posted speed limit in the other direction. But I would suggest that 5 mile an hour variation is typical. That tends to be what we find in doing speed measurements on roadways. But I do want to, I'll get back to that speed measurement because as we talk about sight lines, that's the critical number that we want to use in assessing sight lines. So, and again, as we look at the volume of traffic that was collected on the roadways, and in particular the peak hours on the roadway, so as they collect those turning movement counts from 7 to 9 in the morning, 4 to 6 in the afternoon, they look at the absolute peak hour that happens on the roadway. And then at each of the intersections, as you look through the report, there's actually a little figure in there that shows how much volume of traffic is going through each of those two intersections during the peak traffic volume hour in the morning, so 1 hour, the highest volume hour in the morning, and then the same thing in the evening, the highest volume hour between 4 and 6. As we look at those numbers, one of the things that we do want to see is as we look at the volume of traffic that passes through the Reed Street intersection, it should, or some portion of it needs to show up at the Reedsdale Road intersection unless traffic gets lost between those two locations. And it's not uncommon that that will happen. If you have major traffic generators, if you had a big office building, let's say, between the two intersections, you may have an addition or drop of traffic between those locations. In this case, between those two intersections, there's no real major traffic generators between those two that would say to us that there should be a loss of traffic. But what we did find as we looked at their numbers is there was a significant drop between the intersections, and that drop of traffic ranged between 300 and 500 vehicles. Over the course of an hour, that's very significant. So what we've said to the applicant is that they need to explain how that drop occurred. What is the reasoning for that drop? And getting back to the study area, if the answer to that is that, well, those vehicles use Pleasant Street, and so therefore they didn't show up at the next intersection, we would suggest that a 300 to 500 vehicle drop would mean you need to add that intersection to your study area because there's a significant volume of traffic that's turning off and using that. And again, as you look at the project's traffic, the assignment of traffic from the project, it may also want to use that roadway itself. So when we're looking at impacts from the development, if in fact that's going to be a major route of traffic from the project, it needs to be studied. So the first thing is for the applicant to look at that drop in traffic, explain why it happened. If in fact it was because they're using the Pleasant Street intersection, then that should be added to the study area, and then they need to go back and do traffic counts at that location as well and update the study. The next area that we looked at is pedestrian and bicycle facilities. The applicant did not present information on pedestrian and bicycle facilities in the study, so we've suggested they need to go out and do that when the sidewalks are actually visible from the snow, because we do want to know the conditions of those facilities themselves. The reason that that's important is because pedestrian and bicycle facilities are obviously an important part of the transportation system. This being a residential development, we expect people are going to want to walk. We know there are sidewalks out on Randolph Avenue. We also know this is a bus route on Randolph Avenue. So the project needs to relate to those elements of the transportation infrastructure. And so you need to be presented with some information on what's available out there so that as you look at recommendations and how the project's going to relate to those, you have an understanding of what exists, so then we can look at how the project might be able to embrace those elements of the system. So the next item is public transportation. We know that there's,
Could I ask you one question?
yes,
And I'll show my ignorance of bicycle laws and traffic, but is it legal and proper to ride a bicycle on the sidewalks of Randolph Avenue? Or is it appropriate that they be riding in the street? And if it's appropriate for them to be in the street, do you know whether the street has bicycle lanes? And if that is not the case, should there be bicycle lanes? And what effect would that have on the traffic conditions? Speaking very generally, not having done a study of this.
so the Mass General Law prohibits bicycles from using sidewalks. So the bicycles cannot be on the sidewalk. They're considered a vehicle, and they need to be in a separate facility from the pedestrian facility. So that's not allowed. Mass General Law also says that absent prohibition of the use of the public way, so Randolph Avenue, if there's not a sign posted saying that you cannot ride a bicycle on it, if it's a state highway, then there needs to be a sign that says you can't ride a bicycle on it. They're allowed to use that roadway similar to any other vehicle, and they operate just similar to the rules of the road that a motor vehicle has. So even though you may not be comfortable riding a bike on Randolph Avenue, given the volume and speed, if there's not a sign, it's not prohibited, even though it is.
Did you observe people riding bicycles on Randolph Avenue?
The
during
weather
this?
conditions weren't such that anyone would be out there even. So I'm not saying that they wouldn't when it's a sunny day, but we didn't observe anything, and the weather conditions I don't think were conducive to it at this time of year anyways for that. So I would suggest that based on the information that we have available to us, it's not prohibited. Bicycles are prohibited from using the sidewalk. Now, relative to whether there are adequate accommodations, that's what we suggested. The applicant needs to look at that. Adequate accommodations doesn't mean that there needs to be formal bicycle lanes. As long as the minimum accommodation is a 14-foot wide accommodation, let me put it that way. So if you measure basically from the curb line to the edge of the nearest travel line, so Randolph Avenue being 4 lanes, if at least on the outside lane where the curb lane is, if the dimension from the white dash line to the curb line is at least 14 feet, that's sufficient for shared road accommodation. So a bicycle and a motor vehicle could share that traveled way in an acceptable manner. That's an absolute minimum accommodation. Whether or not there should be bicycle lanes out there, I think is more of a planning exercise on it. But what we suggested from the applicant's perspective is just really demonstrate to us, or at least document, where are the pedestrian facilities, where are the bicycle facilities, and are they adequate for what's out there today? And really what that gets to is again, how the project can relate to that. If there's bicycle accommodations out there that are suitable, then the project, as it looks at the way that it might be able to interact with that, then specific recommendations can come out of that.
Do you have any evidence based upon your experience dealing with projects like this, particularly where there's a large number of one-bedroom apartments here and a lesser number of 3 bedrooms, what percentage of people residing in a project like this would be using a bicycle for transportation to or from work or for recreational purposes? Or are there studies that reveal that type of information, or is it,
They're very limited. I mean, it really deals with what you have in terms of infrastructure that's available to you. I mean, if you have a project that is close to a bicycle facility, then you are going to get a certain percentage of residents that are going to want to reside there because they have that as an amenity itself. If bicycle access is difficult, then that you would tend to have less people that would
how about
choose
using
that
the
as an
Blue
amenity.
Hills, for example, if they want to go up and use the trails in the Blue Hills? And
I think it's an amenity that, depending on how the project is marketed, you could get people that do that. It really has to do with how the relationship of the project to the environment that it has around it. If it has facilities that are suitable for that, then you're going to have more people that will tend to use that. If it doesn't, then you'll have less people that will tend to use it. But another important thing as well as we get into public transportation is a lot of the public transportation vehicles, the buses in particular, have bicycle racks on the front of them. So although you may not be able to ride your bike on Randolph Avenue, you're not comfortable doing that, it doesn't mean that you can't get your bike out to where the bus is and use that to transport you to wherever you happen to be going, and then there may be bicycle facilities there. So again, it's something that, from the applicant's standpoint and from looking at the project, I view these more as amenities and opportunities. And so as the traffic study looks at it, it should be looking at how the project relates to all of those opportunities. So as you look at recommendations on how the project can offset its impact, cut down on the volume of traffic, and in looking at parking, these provide opportunities to reduce traffic impacts, reduce parking demands on the site and such. So they're just things that should be looked at to see if there are, again, if there are opportunities that the applicant can look at the project and relate to those opportunities.
Do sight lines that you're going to discuss in a
Yes.
second, does bicycle participation enter into your sightline calculations, or do they just relate to vehicles pulling out of the project, going left or right, and looking at traffic conditions? And do those sightlines considerations consider someone coming out of the site on a bicycle and trying to take a left turn heading north on Randolph Avenue at 7 o'clock in the morning? Is that a consideration, or is that not?
Well, it is the way that it's a consideration is that it's the type of sight distances that we measure at the intersection itself. So there's two kinds of sight distances, and I'll get into that more
And why
detail.
don't you get into that at that point in your
Sure.
examination?
But it is
I don't want
account-
to lead you astray.
No, that's okay. It is accounted for in the way that the sight distance measurements are done, because I would suggest that the way the measurements are done, it would be something that would be more overly conservative from the standpoint of a bicyclist, although the speed of a bicyclist, the physical speed that they would need to make a left-hand turn coming out of the project in terms of gaps in traffic and such, it's going to be much different than an automobile. But that deals more with operations than safety, and safety is covered in the sight distance relative to a bicyclist that may be trying to cross the roadway.
Thank you.
So we've also, similar to the pedestrian facilities, public transportation, we've asked them to look at. That wasn't mentioned in the traffic study. We know that there's bus routes and bus stops along Randolph Avenue. It's important to understand the service that's there and where those stops are located. That relates to the pedestrian facilities as well, because as people live here that may want to take the bus, we need to make sure that they have a safe traveled way to get to where those bus stops are. So those two will go hand in hand, pedestrian facilities and bus stops and locations. The next area of review deals with, again, safety. So this is the motor vehicle crash history at the intersections they looked at. So they have two intersections in particular they looked at. And they looked at the motor vehicle crashes that are happening at those intersections and seeing if there's any significance. And I'll speak about what significance means. The crash data comes from the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. The local police department also has data, but it is typical that you use the Mass DOT data. That data comes from the Registry of Motor Vehicles to the Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation then imports and codes all of that data and provides that to us as engineers. It's available online actually to anybody that requests it, so that you can look at specific intersections within the town, and you can look at the number of crashes that are happening at the intersection. It gives you information on the dates the crashes happen, the type of crashes, whether there's personal injury, property damage only, fatality. the manner of the crash. So that would be the patterns that happen, whether it was a rear end crash, an angle crash, and such. And what we do as engineers, we look at the crashes at the intersection, and what we're concerned with is first looking at the crash rate. So in order to compare crashes at intersections, we normalize the crashes to a motor vehicle crash rate, and that crash rate is reported as the number of crashes per million vehicles going through the intersection. And so what that allows us to do is once you establish that crash rate, you can look at intersections throughout the town and compare those crash rates so you can see where intersections are that have a higher crash rate than another location. It helps in identifying areas where there's anomalies, higher crash rates, but it also allows, from the standpoint of planning purposes, if you're trying to prioritize funding, you can look at locations that have higher crash rates, and those may be locations where you want to prioritize funding for specific safety-related improvements. So in looking at the two intersections within the study area and calculating the crash rates at those locations, we compare those crash rates to data that's published by the Department of Transportation. They publish an average number of they publish average crash rates for signalized and unsignalized intersections. And so you can look at the crash rate at those locations and compare that to the state averages. And if you find that the crash rate exceeds the state average, then what you look at is you really want to look in more detail at the type of crashes, the manner that those crashes are happening, and then look at if there's ways to address the crash patterns. So in looking at the two intersections that were within the study area, both of those intersections, the crash rate was below the state average, meaning that from the standpoint of are there any anomalies happening or safety issues on the surface relating to crash rates, there was not. So those intersections, although there are crashes happening at those locations, the number of crashes that are happening is not atypical of what would be expected at a signalized intersection. So indicating that there were no safety deficiencies based on the crash data. The next thing that's looked at in the traffic study is a future planning horizon. It's typical, or the prior planning horizon that was recommended by the Department of Transportation was a 5-year planning horizon. So as you do your traffic study and you conduct your traffic counts, the state standard used to be that you look at a future horizon that's 5 years in the future. So from the standpoint of this traffic study, they had looked at the year 2019. The new standard requires a 7-year horizon. So they should be looking at, in this case, a 2021 or 2022 horizon year. The reason that the horizon year was increased to 7 years is because the state recognized that projects take time to go through the planning process. And so because of that, what they wanted to ensure was that when these studies are done, that there is at least a 5-year horizon from the standpoint of the project being built and the town and the state being able to look at 5 years after occupancy. So what was considered reasonable was to allow 2 years for permitting and construction, and then 5 years beyond that for a planning horizon. So that's how the 7-year planning horizon was established. So that's one of the areas where we've suggested from the applicant standpoint, given that we are on a state highway access permit is required, that these standards that, again, were enforced prior to the preparation of the traffic study, they should be looking at a 7-year time horizon. So what that means is they need to adjust their numbers for another few years into the future. Now, the future planning study, the horizon year, basically includes two components. So as you take your existing traffic counts and you're going to grow them into the future, the two components that are looked at are just general traffic growth. So independent of development projects in the area, traffic volumes are going to grow just due to increases in household sizes. You may have someone in a residence today that is not of legal driving age. Within that 7-year time horizon, they will get their license and maybe add another automobile to the household. So that would be included in general traffic growth. That's just an example of how that might happen. There's also developments exterior to the town of Milton that may be constructed that will add traffic. That would also be within that general traffic growth. The other component is specific development projects by others. So if the town has approved a project and that project is not yet built, but it will be within that future horizon and that traffic isn't on the roadway, so it's not accounted for at this time, you want to make sure that you're adding that traffic into the study as well, and that's beyond the general traffic growth. So in looking at those two components, the applicant's traffic engineer looked at historic traffic trends in the area, and again, the Department of Transportation publishes data for at least a 10-year period that we can look at to see how have traffic patterns in the area changed. In looking at that data over a 10-year period, what was found in terms of traffic volumes in the town and just in the region in general, they've grown about 0.5% per year. And so that's the general traffic growth trend, that background traffic growth that the applicant had used. That is, it is appropriate. We've checked that. That is a number that is appropriate for use in growing the traffic volumes based on general traffic growth trends. The specific projects by others, they didn't identify any projects, and it wasn't apparent to us, at least in reading the traffic study, that they had consulted with the town to see if there were any development projects. During the course of our site visit, we noted that on the, I believe it's the southwest corner of, I think it was the,
Reedsdale and.
yeah, the Reedsdale intersection. Yeah, it appears to be a commercial development that's under construction. That was not included in the traffic study based on what we had seen. So at a minimum, we've suggested they need to contact the town, find out if there are any development projects that need to be included in the future horizon. At a minimum, we know that project is under construction and that traffic needs to be added in the study area. So they need to go back and address those two components. The other component is to consult with the town and the Department of Transportation to see if there's any roadway improvements as well that may be completed within those 7 years. The roadway improvements will relate to not only traffic volumes, if there are changes in the roadway network that might affect the way the traffic is using the roadway, may affect trip patterns, but also it may affect the way that traffic operations, so the way that the intersections are operating, the way that the roadway is operating. So they need to go and consult with the Department of Public Works in the town as well as the Department of Transportation and just verify that there are no roadway improvement projects planned within that 7-year horizon that we've asked them to look at. So that future planning horizon I just described, that's what we call the no-build condition. So that's the future planning horizon without the project in place. From the standpoint of looking at impacts of the project, that's the condition that we want to look at in terms of assessing the impact of the project, because the project's traffic gets added on top of that no-build condition. So we need to make sure that that's an accurate baseline before we measure impacts from the project. The next area that we reviewed in the traffic study is the establishment of the volume of traffic that may be associated with the project. So this is the new traffic that will be added onto the roadway network. Will travel through those